imagine the future. Really, close your eyes and picture about 100 years from now. What are people wearing? What did you see? Some cool, smart tech integrations or innovative textiles that respond to the environment, or maybe some futuristic silhouettes that accommodate body augmentations. Cool stuff. You know what I see? I see people wearing what I'm wearing, or what you're wearing. Not just something like what we're wearing, but these exact garments, reinforced at the seams and mended by generations of wearers. Because if we want a future on this planet, we are going to have to change our tendency to consume and dispose into a tendency to repair. I'm Sanne Koevoets and I teach during the day at EUC. At night, I harness the power of craft to manifest other ways of living. And I try to bring the two together in workshops that I organize, where I explore visible mending as a pedagogy for change. And in the next 15 minutes or so, I will present to you my Visible Mending Manifesto in 7 theses, meant as an invitation, but also as an invocation to join me in stitching together a better way of living. So, let's start. We will mend because we must. The fashion industry isn't the only reason for the crisis that we're in, but it surely isn't helping. In 2019, 10% of global carbon emissions, 20% of global wastewater production, 10% of microplastics in the ocean were caused by the fashion industry. And that may have something to do with the fact that the fashion cycle has accelerated from 2 seasons a year to up to 52 new collection drops at some fast fashion retailers. And we as consumers are complicit in upholding this industry because on average, we dispose of an item of clothing after only 7 wears. And actually, landfills are full of garments that are never worn before, some of which were never sold, and some of which we changed our mind on and returned to the store. So that means that the equivalent of 1 garbage truck of textile ends up in a landfill somewhere in the world every single second. That's 200 garbage trucks since I've been standing here. We can't continue this. And by visible mending, we show our commitment to doing better. Second thesis. We're going to have to fight for our right to repair. Why aren't we mending our clothes already? Why do we continue to treat clothing as if it's disposable goods? Why don't we just do like our grandmas did and mend our socks? It's very tempting to think that it's complacency or that it's laziness or people don't care. I admit I used to think so as well. But I've been organizing mending workshops at universities, at conferences, even at an investment bank. And my experience has been that people respond very well to mending. They enjoy the process. They value the skill. It's actually the clothes that are not so amenable to mending. It's a fact that contemporary clothing is simply not constructed to be worn for years and years and years. Take, for instance, seam allowances. So that's the extra fabric that's in between the cut lines and the sew lines of a garment, right? So if you buy vintage clothing, you know that in vintage clothing, often the seam allowances are much more generous. And in contemporary clothing, the seam allowances, like in this shirt, tend to be quite narrow. And you may think, well, that's progress, right? Because that's you conserve fabric that way. You can cut more items out of a single bolt of cloth. Yes, but also no. Because if you want to wear a skirt for 20 years, which not so long ago was really not that unthinkable, then you're going to want to have to, or you're going to have to change it at some point, right? You're going to have to adjust it to changing tastes or to a changing body. And that's where that extra bit of fabric on the sides comes in very handy. So while very narrow seam allowances may maximize the number of items that can be constructed out of a single bolt of cloth, larger seam allowances may maximize or at least increase the number of wears that you may get out of that garment. So the clothing that we buy nowadays is very hard to care for. It's difficult to wash, it's difficult to mend, and it's even difficult to recycle. These types of, well, actually, I'm not wearing that, uh, but a lot of the mixed fiber materials that we wear cannot really be recycled. They can only be downcycled into bedding or some kind of insulation, right? So we really must do better in that sense. We have to fight for our right to repairable clothing. So let's learn about fabric composition, let's learn about garment construction, and let's practice. Let's practice our mending skills on those shitty cheap items that we all have so that we know what to do once we have to care for the things that really matter for us. Third thesis. Mending and repair honor the labor of care. I started the second thesis with the question why we're not mending. Well, again, why are we not mending? Here's another reason why we may not be mending. Patriarchal capitalism, yes, I did it again. Patriarchal capitalism has led to the devaluation of the labor of care. Capitalism only values labor that makes money, right? Patriarchy devalues things that women do, or devalues women and everything they do. So, you can see this devaluation of feminized labor of care even in the way that we talk about labor. Think of the difference between a tailor and a seamstress. And note that we don't talk about tailoresses and seamers. So, what's the difference between a tailor and a seamstress? They do pretty much the same work, but one is associated with creativity, craftsmanship, very highly priced tailor-made clothing, and the other is associated with the very ordinary labor of sewing clothes and repairing clothes, right? Or a similar distinction, knitting and coding. Knitting and coding, well, if you think about it, very similar, actually. Both start from a binary system, are based on sets of encoded instructions that allow for, well, the production of some kind of end product, right? So if you're into coding, everybody thinks it's really cool. If you're into knitting, I know by experience, people think you're really weird and like a grandma, right? So that's political, right? That's structural. And no wonder that liberal feminism tried to emancipate women out of the sphere of domestic labor. But that labor of care is essential for keeping households working, for keeping communities intact, for keeping societies intact. So we have to find our way back to these labors of care. And what we do by visible mending is showing our appreciation for that care label that goes into maintaining our everyday lives. Fourth thesis. The visible mend is also a monument to our foremothers. Why aren't we mending? Yet another reason. These are not excuses. I think they're actually reasons. Why are we not mending? Because we don't know how. Our mothers were busy working their jobs. Nobody taught us in school, because in school we learned were the skills that would enable us to pay other people to repair our stuff, to even better, to buy new stuff, right? That's what we learned in school. So in that place in our collective memory where our mending skills should be is currently actually a large gaping hole. So when we mend, when we sit in a mending circle, inevitably at some point, grandmothers come to the table. And by fumbling about with needle and thread, we reawaken these memories of the knowledge and skill that was passed down, or for a long time used to be passed down, through the female line. Visible mending pays homage, memorializes this type of knowledge, while we also try to regain it and reconnect with it. Fifth thesis. Repairs revolt. And I'm sure that when you think about the revolution, you don't think about a bunch of people sitting around a table with needle and thread. I don't blame you. But consider this. In a society that values or acknowledges success only as far as what your money can buy and not based on what your hands can make, actually, mending is a revolutionary act. We know that the fashion industry is unjust and unsustainable. We know that. We know that the people who make our garments are probably never able to afford those garments. We know that those very same people are likely to suffer the consequences of the negative impact of the fashion industry much more than we ever will. We know this. And when fashion advertising tells us that we can solve this problem by buying more new, sustainable, and fair items, we also know that that's a dirty lie. We're not stupid and we're not blind. But, to paraphrase Slavoj Žižek, ideology is not sustained by what we believe. Ideology actually doesn't care what you believe. Ideology is sustained by how we act. And that turns mending into a revolutionary act. Because when we mend, we refuse to act in accordance to the belief that we can buy our way out of this shit. So, the visible mend. These are the badges on the uniforms of our revolution. And every stitch and every patch is a revolutionary act. The sixth thesis. Through repair, we foster resilience. And this is very important. Through repair, we foster resilience. Because I will acknowledge that by sitting around a table together, week after week, mending our clothes, we are not going to change the system overnight. I'm going to be really, really honest and say that probably most of us are not going to see any system overturned at any point in our lives. And it's frustrating and it's painful to see how slowly changes are made when we need changes so urgently and so fast. It's hard to keep swimming against the current when the current is so strong. So when we sit around this table mending, the same table where the grandmothers appear, when we go out of the head and into our hands, when we feel safe to connect to our feelings, then despair and grief also appear. And that's where the true power of mending reveals itself, because mending is revolt and therapy at once. Virginia Woolf, in the depth of one of her depressions, discovered knitting. And she wrote later, "Knitting is the saving of life." And knitting and Virginia Woolf were the saving of my life when I knitted my way out of a depression stitch by stitch. And of course, it took other things. But the knitting really helped. This ongoing rhythm of the needle, which sort of teaches you the ongoing rhythm of a life that you may learn to live again. Yeah? Monica Aug, an artist who used to practice as a doctor, also found that crafts, especially needle crafts like knitting, embroidery, quilting, I see eyes rolling, but it's really true, have a positive effect on mental health, not only in institutional settings as a sort of creative therapy, but also outside of institutional settings in daily life. And Anne Svetkovich, one of my great heroes of queer and feminist theory, has written a lot about how queer activists for a long time have turned to craft as a way of community building, but also as a form of self-care. And it's not, is my conviction, in any way a coincidence that feminist consciousness-raising practices emerged from women's knitting circles. So, this is the power of craft. That when we come together to find solace from our end of our anxiety, we are simultaneously also moving away from our path to destruction. Eighth thesis, and this is the point. Mending is magic. Mending conjures up a future by simultaneously picturing it and manifesting it with your hands. Mending is witchcraft. It's witchy and it's crafty. By mending, we harness the powers of our foremothers and of our communities to conjure up a better way of living together in this world. And this really is a magical power of mending. So, come into the circle, bring needle and thread. We've got scissors.